This is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to episode number 6.
All right. So, Don, I've heard that our guest today has entered into a pact with some supernatural forces. And essentially, the pact is he doesn't get to sleep, so he doesn't have to sleep at all. He gets a full 24 hours. But there's a small catch. In exchange, what he has to do is Android development for the rest of the hours that he gets free. It's a true story.
And who might you be talking about, Kaushik?
Welcome to the show, Jake Wharton.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on, Jake.
All right. So before we get started with the show, there are a quick few points that we want to touch from the previous show. So in our last episode, we talked about image libraries. And Michel Panzer on Google Plus was a little disappointed that we didn't give UIL, the image library UIL, enough credit. So again, like we said in the last show, we don't want to rule out any library per se, but we're just speaking from experience, and Picasso just seemed like the library to get going quickly, and that's the one that I guess Don and I have most experience in, which is why we probably propped it up a little higher. But one thing that he said was sort of interesting. He said UIL especially is very well architected, and that caught my attention. So I guess when I get some time, I'll probably dig into the library and see how it's done. So just wanted to quickly mention that point.
And I'd also like to give a shout out to Gordon McCrae, who's a listener of the show, and I'd like to thank him for being so supportive. And Kaushik, you actually work with him. And last week when I was visiting your offices in Palo Alto, I didn't get a chance to meet him, so I was a little bummed out. But just wanted to say thanks again for being so supportive of the show, Gordon. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it was fun meeting Don. I didn't expect you were this tall. I mean, I must say, you were pretty tall.
Yeah, most people. That's the thing about working remote or doing everything remotely. A lot of clients that I work for don't know that I'm 6'4", pretty close to 6'5". And so when I show up, everyone's like, "Whoa, you're about a foot taller than we expected you to be." So it's a little interesting.
I have actually met Jake, and Jake's pretty tall too.
Not quite as tall as Don. But
yeah,
I could round up to 6 maybe.
So when you have someone like Jake Wharton on the show, there are like a ton of things we can go on chatting about. Unfortunately, time is always the enemy. But the unique thing about having Jake is like Jake's released like a bunch of stuff already online. He's very kind in releasing most of the stuff that he works on and like the content that he builds for conferences, videos, blog posts, etc. So what we thought in the show we'd like to do is like this is a unique opportunity for us like to find out about things that we otherwise wouldn't know about Jake. So we want to like touch upon how Jake got into Android development and how he's become such an amazing developer and how he's helped the community specifically with Android, and also some of the newer open source libraries that aren't as sort of used as the others. Like there's a new one out by the folks at Square called Moshi, which is a JSON library. So we'll try to touch upon some of those libraries. Now, again, when I say not as famous, everything's relative. I guess like if you go and talk to an Android developer today and ask him or her if they know what Picasso is, they'll think it's probably a part of the Android framework. Like some of these libraries like Dagger and Picasso are sort of a staple for any Android developer these days. So we're going to touch upon certain libraries that you probably may not be using as much and get Jake's opinion on them. Definitely.
So I'd like to start with the more of the meta stuff first. Now, Jake, I think you and I originally met, I think, face-to-face at AndDevCon, like number 2 maybe, and that was, I don't know, that's back before you worked at Square, and I know that you were just working with, I think it was ActionBar Sherlock and maybe a couple other libraries at that time. And so I remember having the discussion with you at the time about how did you get into Android development, and I found it pretty interesting, and I'm not sure a lot of people have had that conversation with you. So would you mind telling us a little bit like how you got into Android development?
Yeah, sure. Basically, when Android was initially announced, they released a preview SDK, and alongside the preview SDK was a contest. And there were something like $10 million in prizes spread across a bunch of categories. And basically you would win $250,000 for first place in a category, or $100,000 for second place, and then like $10,000 for third. And so being a college student at the time and having very limited financial income, I was determined to win $250,000 or $100,000, whatever.
Awesome.
And I was going to be set, I was going to be set the rest of my life.
Sounds like the perfect plan.
Yeah. So I set off, and I knew I had to do something ambitious. So I chose to do like an image editing, like a Photoshop-esque image editing app where you could draw, and there were layers, and it would have like all the Porter Duff blending modes, and way over my head. Ultimately, I think I finished like what would be maybe 10% of what an acceptable app should be, and didn't submit anything to the contest. But it sparked my kind of interest in Android, and ended up just having me always come back to it because it was so approachable and really easy to work with.
Now, what were you working with at the time? Were you always doing Java development?
At that time, I was pretty heavily focused on Python. Just being in school, we mostly worked with C++ or Java. Okay. And Python was like, being a new developer, Python was like a breath of fresh air. Everything dynamic, and it was super forgiving, and you had so much more power and much less surface area of what you had to write. And so I was forced back into Java for Android, and now I've kind of seen the light, and it's actually what I prefer.
Excellent. So I think a lot of people initially probably ran into you in the early days from the ActionBar Sherlock library. How did that come to be?
Yeah, so years later, I never had an Android device, but I had been doing Android development just because it was, I had already paid the like $25 fee, and, you could do it on Linux. Mm-hmm. And I was working for a company where I was transitioning them from physical servers to virtualized servers. We were using VMware vSphere, and it was all like gross .NET interfaces and stuff, and I wanted to write an Android client for it so that I could, be like moving my VMs on the fly from my phone. And this was right at the time that Honeycomb came out. So wanting to support all the different form factors, I was enticed by the Action Bar, and I had to have it. And while there had been existing solutions for your own Action Bar, there was nothing that kind of gave you the best of both worlds, which was the native experience on newer APIs and the compatibility experience on older APIs. So I said, before I write this app, I'm going to write a little shim that's going to do this for me, and then I'll get to the app.
Just a little shim.
Just a tiny little shim, yeah, just to get something working. And then one thing led to another, and I never wrote the app, and I ended up spending hundreds or thousands of hours writing ActionBar Sherlock. It just spiraled out of control. I think, Don, you were actually one of the first handful of people to actually jump in and start adopting it and actually requesting additional features. So if anything, I can blame you for never writing that app.
I remember talking to you about that when we met at the conference, and you said that, like, I never got to finish the app, and because ActionBar Sherlock just had taken so much of your time. So now that like App Compat has come out and everything, has ActionBar Sherlock finally been retired, or what's the status of that?
Yeah, I think most people pretty much understood that when the initial App Compat launched, 12 or 16 months ago, whenever it was, that was really the end of ActionBar Sherlock. So all that was left was pretty much maintaining support for existing integrations. Because there was little reason to actually make the switch when it first came out, because they both had the same value proposition, and it was not until all the lollipop stuff and the material stuff came out that you really had a strong value proposition in making the switch if you hadn't already done so. Right. And so once that started happening, that was really the final nail in the coffin, and I put a big deprecated tag on GitHub, and the website hasn't been updated. So
now, how did that feel after all those thousands of hours of work that you did? Was that a relief, or how did it feel personally to be able to do that?
Oh yeah, nothing gives me greater joy than having a library become obsolete. I mean, it's like a there's a lot of fun in creating something new and supporting it and having a library become popular, but the fact that something's no longer needed because there's a better or a first party solution that actually does the job and does it better than you is like, I just absolutely love completely killing that project off and saying, here's something better, and it has proper support behind it, better documentation, and now it has a ton of more features than I ever could have provided. So it was a really good feeling.
Cool. So I think a lot of people might be interested to learn kind of what is, as an Android developer, what does your setup look like? I mean, do you run multiple monitors? Do you use Genymotion? Do you use just a device, a custom Android Studio configuration? What's kind of your dev setup look like if we were to kind of sit right next to you as a fly on the wall watching you develop?
Yeah, so right now I'm kind of transitioning between setups. I'm moving from working out of Square's main office, where I had a second monitor and monitor stand and a standing table, adjustable table, really nice things. And I'm actually working from home now.
Okay.
So my setup has been drastically reduced. I don't have a second monitor yet, and I thought I would really miss it, but I'm really enjoying the fact that a single monitor forces focus. So when I'm in, Android Studio or Intellij or whatever, I full screen it, and then I'm, completely isolated from notifications and emails and chat and Twitter or whatever. And it actually has really kind of helped me focus more. So I'm thinking I might keep that.
Interesting.
Yeah. But as to like kind of in doing Android development, I switch between Genymotion and a physical device just on a whim. If I happen to be charging my phone, I'll just use that. Or if I'm on a plane, Genymotion, something like that.
Okay.
I don't really have a preference between the two. Genymotion, gives you some things like being able to have pixel, it'll snap the rendering to be pixel perfect with your physical screen. So when you zoom in, when you zoom in on the Mac, like the accessibility zoom, you can get down and like really see pixel perfect, which is really nice. And then it obviously has like the recording controls and GPS controls that, while we have options for that on the physical device, it's much more easy when you're doing it through Genymotion.
Excellent.
As to Android Studio, I mostly keep the configs and stuff the same. We have a style for Square. We actually have two styles. We have one for the just general Java, and then we have one that's Android specific, which is a tiny bit more customized. And then as to the editor, it's mostly left the same. The one thing that I do change is I turn off all the toolbars. I turn off tabs, which is a kind of controversial thing. I rely solely on Command E and Command Shift A, which is the
action thing,
the search. I use that for like splitting windows. You search for like split, and it'll let you split vertically or split horizontally. But so all of my navigation is, and then obviously Command O for opening things. But all of my navigation is done through those three shortcuts. I never have the actual tabs on the top of the screen that I click between. It's a really interesting workflow. I actually saw an article from one of the guys that works at JetBrains, I believe, who kind of evangelized this technique. Mm-hmm. And while it was initially extremely difficult because you kind of feel lost and not having those tabs up there to kind of show you where you've been and quickly jump between, you feel like it's hard to move. But once you kind of get accustomed to Command E, which is like a history of where you've been, and some of the shortcuts that you guys touched on a few episodes ago for like going to last edited position. Mm-hmm. Once you get really accustomed to those, I just found that I actually am moving around much more quickly, so it's the tabs actually end up slowing you down.
Do you use like the Zen mode or something that's come with the Intellij 14 versions, or do you actually just turn off, you try to remove your tabs and do them manually?
Yeah, I just do it manually. It's just disable the toolbars, turn off tabs, and then change the tool windows, the like border, so that it auto hides.
Okay.
And it basically just leaves you with the at the top. I have the breadcrumbs, the file structure, so you can see where you're at.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have the run config on the upper right hand corner. And those occupy the same line.
Kaushik, don't you do something similar? Aren't you very minimal in your setup?
Yeah, I mean, so I actually have a huge monitor, and like even on that huge monitor, I try to like, I do have the tabs show though. I haven't gotten to sort of removing the tabs yet, but yeah, I mean, it makes sense. I'm probably going to try removing the tabs as well. I just like having the code in front of me and just like looking at the code. It just, yeah, I don't know if it actually makes a difference, but yeah, it makes me feel like I'm more focused. So
I have the link to that post, so I'll find it and we can toss it in the show notes and send it to you guys.
That'd be awesome.
Perfect.
Do you have a favorite device that you use on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so I'm actually rocking the old school Nexus 4 right now.
Nexus 4? Wow.
Nexus 4, the white one. It's an absolutely beautiful piece of hardware. I actually really, really like it. And the only reason I'm doing this is in the 10 or 12 years that I've owned a mobile phone, I've never like completely broken a phone to render it unusable.
Mm-hmm.
Always taking good care. I've never used cases or anything either. Just taking good care of them. But for whatever reason, in the last like 5 months, I've just destroyed 3 Nexus 5s. So I don't know what it is. So maybe it was just never meant to be. So I'm back on Nexus 4 now, and I can't upgrade to the Nexus 6 because I don't have giant hands. So I'm going to hold off with the 4 until a hopefully more reasonable Nexus phone comes out in the fall.
That's kind of the way that I felt about the 6. And even though I'm a bigger guy and I do have bigger hands, I just don't want to feel like I'm holding up like a tablet to my face when I'm on the phone. And it just feels, and I just see it, and it's so huge. So I'm in the same camp as you for sure.
Although now that the Project Fi has been announced and it only works on the Nexus 6,
right.
That might be the thing that actually will force me to get one.
So what exactly is Project Fi for those that don't know?
Yeah, so it was announced, I think, yesterday or 2 days ago, which is, well, when this airs, it'll be a few days ago. It's Google's sort of a meta wireless carrier where they abstract away the actual cell provider. So in this case, they're using both Sprint and T-Mobile. And then they're also leveraging Wi-Fi. So as you move around, as you know, either Sprint or T-Mobile has better service, or perhaps you're in the range of high-speed Wi-Fi, it will transparently switch between these different networks, all while not losing data connectivity.
Wow!
And they have competitive pricing, and it's mostly emphasized on data because obviously, even talk and text is data, despite the fact that carriers insist on billing it otherwise. Mm-hmm. It's emphasized on data and charging you for only what you use, not for like a tiered structure. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I'm excited to kind of get my hands on it and see how it works.
I was pretty excited about the announcement too. Unfortunately, about last week, I think I sold my soul and I got a Samsung S6. It was, I've always been sort of anti-Samsung, but I don't know, it was like a whim, like, so my contract was up, so I thought I'll just go and see if I could get a better phone. And I've heard good things about the camera, and I must say the camera on this device is amazing. This TouchWiz is just, it's horrible. I've got another like 20 days, I guess, to exchange it, and I think TouchWiz just might do it for me. I might like go back and change the device and wait for the Nexus 6 now that Fi is announced. But I'm trying to give it a fair shot.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I believe, the 6, the 5, and the 4 are like are 3 of the 5 top devices we see in most apps as the most used piece of hardware.
Yeah, that's the other thing. For in terms of metrics, like in like collecting data about your app, do you use like Google Analytics? Do you use like Crashlytics or something, or like what do you guys generally use?
Yeah, it varies a little bit. We also have our own in-house system. Not really metrics. I mean, it can be used for metrics and analytics. It's like an event. It's just a generic event service, and then internally we can write more specific projections of that data. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we have relied on external services in the past, and still sometimes do for smaller projects, whether it's like a Mixpanel or like a Flurry or a Crashlytics or Bugsnag for crashes and things like that.
Makes sense. So going into development, I thought like we can touch upon some things that at least I've always wanted to know. So Jake, I'm sure you mentor like a bunch of Android developers today, both in and out of Square. So if an Android developer came up to you and asked specifically like, hey, what are 5 things I should be doing to sort of get better? What would like your suggestion be?
Yeah, so I mean, I can definitely think of some. We'll see if I can get 5. I think one of the biggest ones that we see now, not so much as the developers that I interact with directly at Square, but just kind of in the community, is there's this sense of the fact that like every engineer, everything that comes out of Google is like the canonical way and the only way of doing something. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say that like some of the smartest people in the world don't work there, and some of the best ideas and libraries for Android actually do come out of there. It's just the problem is the blind acceptance of anything that comes out of Google as like the way of doing something.
I agree.
So you just having this sense where you just need to like think and judge for yourself as to whether or not something, whether it be a library, whether it be a technique or a pattern, is actually the right solution for your needs, your requirements, and your applications. Just and maybe it is. I think oftentimes it almost always is the right solution, but just losing that like unquestioning acceptance of something. I think we see a little too much of that today. So that would definitely be a big one. Let's see. I think being extremely comfortable with going down into like the Android source code is something that's extremely important to know how to do, and to know like where to look. There's nothing like the realization that there's nothing magic happening. Like there's always an answer, and that answer might be just inside, text view, which is an awful huge file, but it's in there.
Yes. Or fragments, right? Your favorite?
Or fragment, or yeah. But there's always an answer, right? And if you can take the time, you figure out where the source is, and you figure out how to like follow method calls inside the Android source code. Being able to do that is an extremely valuable resource, and you'll end up solving a lot of problems that otherwise would end up, just on Stack Overflow or somewhere like that. That was only 2. Let's see.
Quick follow up on the source code. So when you sort of navigate and like try to dig into the source code, do you have any like I remember seeing either a mention on Twitter or something where you basically give advice to someone on how you should be navigating. Do you have it linked inside Android Studio? Or do you actually use Chrome with like some extension? Like if I wanted to quickly dive into the source code, like how do you do it?
I think there's a few ways. The easiest is with Android Studio now, it will link the sources, assuming you have them downloaded. It will automatically link the sources for your compile version. So the version of Android you're compiling against, the sources will automatically be linked. So you can just use your normal shortcuts to Command B directly into your text views and your view groups or whatever. But oftentimes it's not. It's just like a subset. It's only kind of what's exposed in the API is linked there. So if you end up, it's very hard to like follow method calls that traverse into parts of Android that aren't actually public APIs. So for that, I do have the Android the AOSP entire source tree cloned.
Wow.
It takes quite a lot of space. So I don't necessarily recommend that for everyone. And you kind of alluded to this, but there's two good ways to actually browse the source on the web. There's a Chrome extension, which I think is Roman Nurik's extension, the SDK. I forget the name of it.
We'll have a link to the show notes.
Yeah. So not only does it let you search for APIs in the Omnibar in Chrome, but whenever you're viewing JavaDoc on the developer site, it puts a link to the source code for that class directly on the page, and you can just jump right into it. Now, the disadvantage there is that it's just plain text, right? You're just looking at the plain text of source of that file, so you can't, again, jump around very easily. But there's a website called, well, there's actually two. There's one called AndroidXref, which actually linkifies like method calls and such. And then there's Grepcode, which also hosts the Android source code and allows you to kind of jump between versions and jump around inside of it.
Makes sense.
So there's a bunch of different ways. I guess it kind of depends on what you're doing. I'll often use the view source link on the web and find that the answer is not directly in this source file, so I need to go elsewhere. And that's where I'll either jump to my local copy of the source code or I'll jump over to one of those other websites.
Cool. So we'll follow up through. If you think of any other tips, we can hop back in later in the show. It's no big deal. We'll just keep moving here. I think one of the questions that Kaushik and maybe a lot of people have is, if Square was hiring an Android developer, what would be some of the skills that you would specifically look for in an Android developer?
Yeah, so we are hiring. as a slight correction there.
What?
But yeah, I think there's a few, at least that I personally look for. I really like seeing developers come in that are multidisciplined. So like it's fine if Android is your main thing, but I really like seeing where somebody has like a Ruby or a Python or JavaScript project, or maybe they wrote some funky thing in Haskell, or potentially newer languages like Rust, or just seeing that they're not solely kind of constraining themselves to a single platform and a single language. Because I think there's a lot of value in just seeing what else is happening. Even if you're not a master of one of those other languages, as long as you're being exposed to it, you're opening your mind up to different ways of approaching problems and solving problems and different techniques. So just seeing that is a really strong indicator of someone that kind of has a desire to do more than just be the best, Android developer, because you can't be the best Android developer unless you kind of open your mind up to those things.
Especially if you're interviewing with Jake Wharton. I mean, it's kind of hard. But
I'm not too tough to interview. I think I'm not too, hopefully not too unapproachable, and I try and have a very casual interview. But actually, another good one, which kind of is similar, is a very strong indicator, I think, is a good grasp of tooling. So if you're doing Java, at least at Square, we let you, we don't do whiteboard or anything. You're in front of a computer and you can use whatever you want. So if you're in, you can be in Intellij, and if you're using shortcuts and, to pop JavaDoc for a method, or to refactor, or to extract methods, extract variables, that's a really strong sign from that you have you're in this tool, and not only are you in the tool, but you've mastered the tool and you've made it work for you, rather than just using it as sort of a dumb text editor. I've seen people come in and they choose Vim, and I'm like, oh, Vim. I'm not a Vim or Emacs person, but they'll just start. It looks like they're not even. They're just like button mashing on the keyboard, and Vim is just like bent to their will, and it's doing all these crazy things, and that's like, I love seeing that, because it means that this person spends a ton of time in Vim, and rather than wasting their time doing repetitive tasks, they've figured out how to make Vim work hard for them.
Makes sense. I also am a big fan of like making sure the tools work for you. I mean, if I find myself typing something more than twice or thrice and I'm like, can I make that a live template or like, with Intellij? I think that makes a lot of sense. You have to use the tools to their fullest potential. So what else?
I agree.
I think probably another big one is just the resourcefulness of someone. A lot of times you'll see people come in and we say this up front, is that, use whatever you want, whether it's the internet or libraries, anything. I really, like, if I ask you a question and I say, I don't know, what's an interview problem? Like, do solve the queens on the chessboard thing. If there's a library out there, if there's a Python library out there that's just like a one-liner where it's like, solve the 8 queens problem,
yeah,
and that gives you the answer, you can use that. But you better be prepared to defend that choice and explain, how it's working and why it's better than writing your own. And then you also better be, our interview is not going to be just 2 minutes of you writing that one method. You also better be prepared for what comes after that, which is when I change the problem, how are you going to, reconcile that with this library?
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Those are great tips on basically like getting started and becoming a better developer. But what if I wanted to take it to like, the next level? Like the simple questions. Okay, I want to become better than Jake Wharton. So what should I be doing? I mean, what does Jake Wharton do to basically like take it to the next level? Where do you draw your inspiration from? Like,
I guess it goes back to kind of what I said earlier, which is the multidiscipline thing. And I gave a lot of examples that actually are personal to me. I really enjoy reading about what other languages, what other libraries, especially ones that are kind of on the bleeding edge and really, really emerging right now, what they're doing to solve common problems. So, like Go obviously has become wildly popular in the last year or so, and it's really brought to light, concurrency and lightweight threads, things like that. Rust is a fairly new language, just about to hit a 1.0, and it has some really interesting things about like the scoping of objects and who owns objects and how that plays into like concurrency. So really just kind of reading what else is going on other than just, Java and Android, because there's a lot of really smart people that are not doing Android and are not doing Java. And if you're not kind of looking at what they're doing, you're going to miss things that you can take from and actually apply to Android or apply to Java. JavaScript's another big one. Everyone hates JavaScript and likes to kind of, likes to call out all its faults. But it's a language where you can get away with so many things that really enables people to write some stunning libraries and patterns with. I assume eventually we're going to talk about RxJava, and I'll just say that my knowledge of RxJava was kind of taken to the next level when I found libraries that were built on the JavaScript version of Reactive RxJS, and specifically there's one called CycleJs, which is just this like taking reactive to the extreme, like take it to its logical extreme where everything is reactive, and just it's kind of blew my mind, and I cannot stop playing with it. It's an absolutely fantastic piece that through this I've learned a ton of things about just how to model things in a reactive style, and now I can apply that back to our RxJava usage in Android.
Interesting. CycleJs. I haven't heard of that. I've looked at RxJS, but I've never heard of CycleJs. That'll be pretty interesting to look at. Yeah.
Definitely add a link to it. It's Andre Staltz, I think is the guy's name. He's given a bunch of talks as well. And I think he actually he contributes a lot to RxJS in tandem with CycleJS.
So obviously open source is a big thing for the folks at Square and also for you. You've released like a ton of libraries that are super useful. I had a bunch of questions, but before we even go into that, I want our listeners to definitely take a look at a recent keynote that you gave with another person who has the same initials as you, Jesse Wilson. Both of you gave like the keynote at Droidcon Montreal, right? So that was all about open source. So definitely, I think listeners should have a look at that. I had some questions specifically about open source. So obviously with ActionBar Sherlock, Timber, Hugo, like they're like a bunch of open source libraries that you've personally released and have done very well in that it's become super useful for many people. But one key aspect about open source projects is knowing how to sort of captain the ship properly, like maintaining the library, nurturing it, making sure you do the right things, and people who use the library don't get frustrated. Do you have any sort of stories to share, any tips on how we should be sort of captaining an open source project and trying to ensure that it becomes a success and is useful to most people who consume it?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a few very important aspects of being at the head or participating and leading a project. And you're right, we do touch on this in that keynote. So I would definitely suggest people check it out because there is a video now that was just posted. One of the big ones, I guess, is just really understanding what the goals of the library are and how much of the solution to the problem that the library is trying to solve actually belongs in the library. So we touch on this in the keynote, but basically almost every library is going to come with some, 80 or 90% of the features that you actually want. Mm-hmm. And then there's still going to be some aspect that is not handled, whether it's tying into your data sources or using a different serialization format or, whatever. There's some aspect that you're still going to have to do yourself. And a lot of people are going to feel like, wow, I have this problem. So everyone else must have this problem, and I'm going to make this library better by contributing back to it and adding this, fundamental missing feature. Like, I can't believe they missed this. Mm-hmm. But what you come to realize, and what's very important for a project maintainer to have, is the strong discipline on what actually belongs in the library and what does not. You definitely want to make sure that the features in the library are going to be applicable to as many people as possible, ideally everyone. Because once you start introducing, features and extension points that are specific to a tiny subset of your users, these things they're not free, right? They're gonna end up causing burden on you, the maintainer, over time. And ultimately, they're going to end up interacting with each other. So the person that wants support for Jackson, not JSON, mm-hmm. is going to be conflicting with the person that wants to use JSON annotations in another part of the library. Well, and this actually is an example that came up recently mm-hmm. in one of our libraries where it would be useful to say, oh, well, if you're using JSON, we can use, one of its features somewhere else in the library. But then if you're not using JSON, well, what does that mean for this feature somewhere else in the library mm-hmm. if the person's using Jackson, or maybe they're not even using JSON? So it's just being mindful of what actually belongs in the library and what doesn't. There's a lot to be said about samples and example code and what belongs in, like, even just test cases that show you how to do things that may only appeal to some people. And I think those are the right places for those features to go. Direct these things into a sample project, or maybe someone else's, their own library that adds to yours. I think as a new maintainer of a project, especially one that becomes popular very quickly it can be tempting to just accept anything that anyone is willing to contribute, because it's a vastly exciting thing. And you want to kind of engage and enrich the experience of all your users. But ultimately, if you do this, you're going to end up harming them in the long term, just because your library will kind of grow out of your control.
So you bring up, contributors, which is excellent. Now, I've contributed to a couple of libraries, some Square stuff, some of your stuff, some other ones as well. And I'm familiar with it, but I think there's a lot of people that are not familiar with how to contribute to open source. What's probably the best recommendations you can give to someone who wants to contribute? Should they be following some type of guidelines? How do they make, a good pull request? Should it be small? Should it be large? Or what can they start helping with right out of the gate?
There's a lot there. And there's a lot that you can do. I think there's definitely some important things to take into consideration when you're trying to contribute. I really like when people start small. If I don't know you personally or through other contributions, I'm going to be hesitant initially of anything that you're trying to change. And that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. But by starting small with, fixing a tiny bug or maybe even just like documentation changes, it's a great way to kind of just kickstart a relationship with a project maintainer. And we touch on this in the keynote again, where if you're adopting a library for the first time, so if you're just pulling in JSON or whatever for the first time, you're in a unique position where you're going through parts of the documentation that the project maintainers, never really have a good experience with, which is the getting started, the first run experience, the integration experience. Mm-hmm. And so you're going to find problems with it. You're going to find errors. You're going to find APIs that have changed and the documentation hasn't been updated. Those are great first contributions to a project, because not only is the project maintainer going to get to know you as a contributor, but you're going to get to know the project maintainer and whether or not they're receptive to these changes, whether or not they're active and merging these in and making releases. Or maybe you'll find out that the project is just completely abandoned, and that's a good indicator to you that maybe you shouldn't be using it. But to code, to actually getting into like the meat of the library and contributing to it, I'd say there's like a solid 3 things that should be done for most changes, which is start off with a discussion, whether it be just on an existing GitHub issue or a new GitHub issue, about whether first off, it's a feature, whether the feature is needed and wanted in the library, and if it's a bug fix, whether or not if it's not trivial, whether or not the approach that you're going to take to fix the bug is the right one. Because I think there's nothing worse in the project and contributor relationship than you writing a bunch of code, submitting it as a pull request, and then just they don't want to merge it for whatever reason, because you didn't communicate up front that you were going to be doing all this work, and it's awkward for both of you because you wrote all the code, they don't want the code. So just start with a discussion on a GitHub issue or whatever, wherever the project's hosted. Then, of course, making the change is important. You want to adhere to the existing style of the project, tabs, 4 spaces, 2 spaces, where the curly braces on a new line or the same line, things like that.
Hungarian notation is another thing you love. Yeah,
love that Hungarian notation. But if the project, if they're using it, I'm contributing to it, I'm going to slap that M and I'm going to slap that S in front of my variables, just because I don't want someone to go into a source file and be like, oh yeah, I see these 12 lines of code. This must have been what Jake contributed because it's not using Hungarian notation and it's only 2 space indent. That's not what you want. You want the entire source file to feel like a cohesive, chunk that is otherwise just not really owned by any single person, but it just fits in with everything else in their project.
Completely agree.
Great point.
And then the third thing is just tests. Tests on Android. You guys covered this in the first episode, but it's a lot easier if it's just like a Java library that's used on Android. But submitting changes with tests is the best because it saves me from having to do manual verification, and oftentimes we can just hit the giant green button and merge or change, without any ceremony whatsoever. Another thing that we kind of touch on in the keynote is another great first contribution, if it's not necessarily first, but if you're unable to actually fix a bug or you're unable to actually implement a feature for whatever reason, I think RxJava is actually a really unapproachable library for contributing complex fixes to, because there are some insanely smart people working on it and they're squeezing every ounce of performance out of it, which means the code it can be very hard to read because it's very performance sensitive. But it's very easy to write just a test which demonstrates either a bug or demonstrates a desired feature. So maybe you can't write a bug fix, but you can submit a pull request that contains a test which is failing. And then that allows the project maintainer they're the ones that are familiar with the code. They can just jump in with your test case and they'll be able to very quickly fix the bug. It's kind of like the bug report, but with superpowers, because it gives the project maintainer a way to concretely know whether they've fixed the problem that you're reporting.
I think that's probably one of the best open source tips I've heard in probably years. Just submit a failing test. That's a phenomenal tip there. So I think those are great tips, Jake. And we talked previously about ActionBar Sherlock, how you had basically kind of deprecated it at one point because of AppCompat came out and so forth. Now, are there other instances that you have encountered, or do you have any ideas of when it's a good time to kind of kill off an open source project, other than the instance of maybe it's been deprecated by a better library from Google or so forth? Do you have any ideas, or have you killed off any other projects?
So I've killed off like 4 or 5, I think, in the past year or so, at least personal ones. But I think all of those instances have been where the functionality and the features have been offered by Google, by either merged into the support library or like AppCompat, like you said. Mm-hmm. I guess another reason would be, there's 2 other kind of ones that I can see. So with ActionBar Sherlock came a library called 9-volt Androids, which was a backport of the Honeycomb animation APIs, the APIs that came out in basically across all of the 3 Honeycomb releases. It backported those to API 1, which was fun.
API 1, wow.
API 1, yeah. Actually, if you go
don't
to
support that anymore?
I do not support that anymore.
Oh.
Tisk.
I guess I've changed what I'm doing.
But so the library hasn't been updated in quite some time. And there have been newer APIs that were introduced in the animation framework. Mm. But the whole point of 9-volt Androids was taking for the purposes of argument, let's just call it ICS, taking the ICS and up APIs and putting them on pre-Honeycomb. And if you've been following the trends of the device dashboard, the dashboard that has the statistics of what APIs, what versions of Android are accessing the Play Store, you've seen that over the last year or so, pre-Honeycomb has been drastically dropping. I think Gingerbread's down to 8% or something, and then Froyo and Claire have fallen off the chart. So the need for these libraries is just going away because you really aren't targeting those APIs anymore, so you don't need that functionality. So I guess that's one case. I mean, you could kind of call that being replaced by Google since it's in Android, but I don't know if I would call it exactly that, because you still have like AppCompat needs to exist, and it will probably always exist as just this library that supports a window of API levels and always backports kind of the latest. So the need for it will probably never go away, whereas the animation APIs aren't always being updated like the design languages. So just the need for the library kind of disappeared. And then I guess the other one would be just when a better solution has come out. So we kind of haven't put the nail in the coffin yet, but I think a good example of this is kind of Otto, the event bus library that we have at Square. So we haven't used, Otto's still kind of in use a little bit, but at least on the projects I've been working on, we haven't used Otto in a year and a half, if not more.
Oh, wow.
There's really, so it's not going away or anything, but I think there's two kind of important things that have happened. One is that we think we found a better mechanism. That mechanism is the reactive APIs, RxJava, where we can create a much more specific pipeline of events than a giant generic bus that just shoves any event across it. And now that's not to say that there's anything wrong with that. It's just that the complexity of our applications has grown to the point where that's just not a reasonable solution. And then I think the other thing is that the library itself is very narrow in focus. It does one thing and it tries to do that one thing very well. And there just hasn't been a strong need for a ton of new features that have been developing in it. So the project just sits, and it sits, as it is, and it doesn't really need any constant maintenance as project maintainers, and we really don't get many contributions in that would add a lot of value to the project. So while I'm not going to say that the project's like retired and it's deprecated or anything, it's just kind of stagnant, but that's fine.
It's kind of a maintenance mode almost, right?
Yeah. It's stable. It works. It solves a very specific problem. And while we've mostly outgrown it ourselves, there's no real pressing need to deprecate it. But we also don't have to, give a lot of our time to it. So it's just kind of sitting there. And I think that's a fine thing. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just something to be aware of as like a project maintainer that this, eventually might happen. And that's a fine thing. You just leave it there and let it be. And if the time comes, the time will come where either we can just say, hey, this is done, let's deprecate it. Or, hey, maybe we should take a look at this again and, breathe new life into it and revitalize it. But neither of those things are happening now. So there it sits.
Makes sense. Yeah. I mean, especially like one challenge, I guess, with Otto is like at least like a couple of the other projects I've worked on use Otto, and I don't really have a strong inclination at this point to go and like rip it out, like even though like there are alternatives. So I guess like that's another reason to like have it going, right? Like, do you have any of the Square projects that use Otto internally already, which you don't intend to sort of like change at this point?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. We have seen its usage decline a bit as we've pushed RxJava into more of our apps. But there's pieces of the apps that have just been sitting on Otto as the mechanism of transferring information, and there's no reason to change them unless something comes up where it breaks, or we could add some behavior that would be more advantageous than just leaving it as is.
Makes sense. All right, it's time to wrap up the first part of the show with Jake. Now, Jake was super kind and stayed on to share a lot more information about RX Android, SQLite, and his amazing picks for the show. So definitely do stay tuned for the next episode. You can find the show notes for episode 6 at fragmentedpodcast.com/episodes/6, and we'll see you in the next episode.